So, Prince George is sitting at Adelaide Cottage asking his dad if he did something wrong. And that right there is the entire story. Not the palace declaration, not the constitutional wording, not the headlines screaming about Camilla's kids being cast out. A child asking whether he caused a family fracture. That's what actually happened at the center of this whole thing. And honestly, the fact that a 9-year-old had to ask that question tells you everything about how badly the adults around him messed up before the king finally stepped in. Before we get into the details, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe so you don't miss updates on stories like this. It really helps the channel, and I appreciate it. So here's where it gets weird. Buckingham Palace apparently held a sealed meeting where Charles signed a binding declaration naming Prince George as the direct dynastic heir, and the documents specifically removed Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopez from every internal succession provision, emergency regency consideration, inheritance expectation, and continuity plan tied to the crown. Now Tom and Laura never had a legal claim to the throne. They're Camilla's children from her first marriage. Everyone knows this. So the question isn't why they were removed from something they were never in line for. The question is why their names had to be written into a formal declaration at all. Like if there was no issue, if there was no threat, if nothing had happened, then why does a binding royal document need to spell out that the Queen's adult children from a previous marriage cannot under any circumstances have delegated authority over royal estates, archives, guardianship arrangements, or ceremonial appointments connected to a minor heir? That's not a clarification. That's a response to something specific. William apparently read the opening paragraph, glanced at George's empty chair, and asked whether his son had been told. Nobody answered. That silence is loud because it means either George was being protected from a conversation, which makes sense, or the conversation was happening so fast and so secretly that even the future king didn't know what his own son had been informed of. Either way, the whole thing had clearly been fast-tracked. Charles refused Camilla's request for before publication. He said the delay had already lasted too long. That's not the language of routine constitutional housekeeping. That's the language of someone who realized the problem had been allowed to sit and fester and grow, and now it had to be dealt with immediately before it got worse. So what actually triggered this? Because the declaration didn't come out of nowhere. Months earlier, there was a private briefing at Windsor Castle, a continuity planning meeting, which is basically emergency planning for what happens if both the King and the Prince of Wales become temporarily unavailable. Standard stuff in theory, except during this meeting, a proposal was placed in front of William. The suggestion was that Tom Parker BS be listed as a family liaison, giving him 3 minutes access to selected household discussions involving Prince George, if Charles and William were both absent. Now, on the surface, maybe that sounds practical. Camilla apparently argued that she was building a trusted circle around the boy, not reaching for authority. She said Tom's discretion, experience, and loyalty to Charles could provide stability in a crisis. But here's the thing about proposals that sound modest on the surface. You have to look at the paperwork underneath. William closed the folder before the official could finish reading. He asked whether his father had approved Tom's name. Camilla said the idea was practical, not political. But when Catherine turned the page, she found language granting the proposed liaison access to George's schedule, selected correspondence, and future household planning. That is not a casual family support role. That is detailed institutional access. And Catherine immediately understood why the draft felt wrong. It was too specific to have emerged from a casual conversation. She asked who had written it. The room went silent. Camilla repeated that she had never requested such broad powers, but the pages were already there, already drafted, already in front of them. And here's the part that makes the timeline genuinely suspicious. William discovered after the meeting that the proposal had been discussed twice with royal estate officials before reaching him. Charles had never formally approved it, but he also hadn't stopped those discussions when they first crossed his desk. He let them move forward. That's not approval, but it's also not protection. And for William, that silence was almost as damaging as the proposal itself. Catherine wrote down the date and exact wording in a private note that evening. She told William the issue was no longer whether Camilla intended harm. The real danger was that someone had begun treating George's future as something open to negotiation. That's the line that changes everything. Because once a child's future role becomes a bargaining chip, even in small ways, even with good intentions, the door is open, and someone had clearly walked through it. When William confronted Camilla and Charles together, he didn't raise his voice. He pulled an unused chair away from the table, placed the Windsor proposal where Camilla could see it, and asked who believed they had the right to plan access to his son without his consent. That's not a rhetorical question. He genuinely wanted to know who thought this was acceptable. Charles stared at the document. Camilla stared at William. No advisors, no secretaries, no lawyers, just the three of them. William then placed two dated memoranda beside the original proposal. These papers showed that the idea had moved between private offices for weeks. One carried a handwritten instruction ordering staff to keep it outside the Constitutional Secretariat, which is the small official team responsible for checking whether palace decisions follow royal and legal rules. That instruction is the smoking gun. You don't tell staff to 6 minutes keep something away from the constitutional checkers unless you know it wouldn't pass scrutiny. Camilla leaned closer, recognized the handwriting, and it belonged to a trusted member of her household. Someone on her team had taken her suggestion and expanded it far beyond what she claimed to have requested. Camilla's shock apparently seemed genuine. She insisted she never asked for those powers. But here's the problem. Even if she didn't write the expanded version, someone in her orbit felt confident enough to draft it, circulated it, and attempt to keep it hidden from the people whose job is to catch exactly this kind of overreach. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens in an environment where people believe this kind of move might succeed. Charles tore the proposal in half and announced that a binding declaration would replace every informal understanding. Camilla asked whether her children would be named. He said ambiguity had created the danger, so ambiguity had to end. And honestly, when you actually look at what was said versus what happened, that answer is devastating. He's not saying Tom and Laura did anything wrong. He's saying the lack of clear boundaries allowed someone to exploit the gray areas, and the only way to close those gaps permanently was to name names and remove any possible interpretation that Camilla's children had dynastic standing. The king then summoned a constitutional counselor and ordered him to remove every possible path by which informal family influence could touch the future sovereign. This counselor, working through the night, went after emergency advisory roles, guardianship consultation, privileged archive access, estate authority, and inherited ceremonial expectations. Each individual channel looked harmless alone. Together, they could create the impression that Camilla's children possessed standing they didn't actually have. And that appearance matters enormously, because influence around a young heir can become power long before anyone admits what's happening. Charles asked whether Tom and Laura's names could be omitted from the final document. The counselor said no. Unnamed restrictions can later be softened, reinterpreted, or quietly ignored. Named exclusions leave no space for manipulation. So the king made the call. He chose the harder public wording himself, because he understood that his own delay had allowed the confusion to grow, and he would now carry responsibility for ending it. Then things got even messier. The counselor uncovered a dormant estate memorandum proposing a permanent consultative role for one of the Queen's children at a royal property after Charles's death. The document had never been signed, but its existence proved that informal expectations had traveled further than anyone had confessed. This wasn't just one rogue staffer drafting one overreaching proposal. There were multiple documents, multiple discussions, multiple attempts to create roles and access points that had never been formally authorized. Princess and reviewed the final declaration structure at her brother's request and told him the crown could not maintain two definitions of family, one based on affection and another activated whenever authority became available. That's classic and blunt accurate, and completely unwilling to confuse loyalty with comfort. So the declaration was finalized. George was named directly not to bypass William, but to protect the next generation. Every continuity arrangement would now move through Charles, the prince, his son, and the lawful line descending from them. The document was secure by dawn, but beyond the locked office, telephones were already ringing, invitations were being reconsidered, and Camilla's children were about to discover what official exclusion felt like in practice. A name disappeared from a private guest list, and a state briefing was canceled. 2 security clearances, were quietly downgraded. Tom Parker BS received a call informing him that a future gathering involving Prince George would proceed without him. He thanked the caller, placed a telephone on his desk, and remained motionless. The palace insisted the changes separated personal affection from institutional power. Charles and Camilla could still invite her children to birthdays, dinners, and private family occasions, but no invitation or relationship could now be treated as an official position. Tom opened an old photograph taken with his mother before her royal marriage. Anger tightened his face, then slowly gave way to sadness. Camilla's ascent had brought him near enough to the crown to be publicly pushed away from it. He had never expected authority, yet the declaration made his absence feel like a danger had been removed. That distinction is brutal because a private son was now being discussed as though he had once stood between George and the throne. Laura reacted differently. During a recorded telephone conversation with Camilla, she asked for no campaign, no correction, and no attempt to recover lost privileges. Her controlled voice carried more pain than outrage. She wasn't accepting the decision so much as retreating from the royal world entirely. Camilla heard emotional distance growing between them and realized her daughter was pulling away, not because she was angry, but because she was done. Then a partial copy of the declaration leaked to a national broadcaster. The headline screamed that George had been named direct heir, suggesting William himself had been pushed aside, which was completely false and deeply dangerous. William understood immediately that confusion outside the palace could now deepen the fracture inside it. He decided to meet Kama alone. No Charles, no Catherine, no lawyers, no officials, just the two of them. William sat opposite Kama and said he had not come to ask for an apology. He had come because George should not inherit a family permanently poisoned by decisions made in his name. Camilla admitted that years of being treated as an intruder had changed her. She had become determined that Tom and Laura would never feel invisible beside the royal family. In trying to secure their dignity, she had failed to understand how the liaison proposal threatened William and Catherine. Her intention had been acceptance. The result had felt like intrusion. Then she did something genuinely significant. She removed the Windsor memorandum from a drawer, pulled out the handwritten page, carrying her original suggestion, and tore it into several pieces. She told William that no member of her family would ever again be proposed for any role involving George. Her voice shook, but the promise was clear. William responded with a boundary of his own. Tom and Laura would not be erased from private family life. He would stop unnecessary exclusions from birthdays, dinners, or gatherings unrelated to royal authority. But he would not revise the declaration protecting the direct line. George's future could not be left open to emotional pressure again. Camilla asked for only one thing. She wanted William to state publicly that her children had never sought the throne of regency or control over his son. He agreed to stand beside Charles during the full explanation and confirmed that his own position remained unchanged. George had been protected, not advanced toward the crown. Camilla finally admitted that Charles had chosen the monarchy over her wishes, but she no longer believed he had chosen George over Tom and Laura. The king had separated love from power before the two became impossible to untangle. That distinction matters because it's the difference between rejection and boundary setting. One is personal, the other is institutional. And confusing them is exactly what created this whole mess in the first place. By midday, the declaration no longer belonged to the family. It belonged to broadcasters, newspaper editors, constitutional commentators, and crowds pressed against the gates of Buckingham Palace. One front page reduced years of private tension to 6 words. George secured. Camilla's family cashed out. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming as commentators argued over whether George's designation had changed the royal order. Palace correspondents rushed to explain that William remained the next heir and his son still followed him. The constitutional order had not been rewritten. The declaration gave George unprecedented protection from private influence over his preparation household and future authority. But the public narrative had already split. Some applauded the defense of the direct line. Others called the wording cruel because Tom and Laura had been publicly excluded from positions they had never claimed. Camilla paused behind a closed door before entering the palace press room. She asked Charles whether standing beside him would make her appear defeated. He answered that it would show the monarchy had survived disagreement, without pretending the conflict had never happened. She took a breath and followed him inside. Charles delivered the clarification himself. He confirmed that William's position remained unchanged. George stood next after his father, and the declaration existed to stop private relationships becoming alternative centers of royal authority. He did not soften the boundary, but he refused to turn it into an accusation. William then honored his promise to Camilla. He stated publicly that Tom and Laura had never sought constitutional power, a regency, or control over George. He said the new provisions protected the lawful line and should not be treated as proof of personal wrongdoing. Catherine watched the statement from Windsor beside her son. She lowered the television volume when commentators began discussing George as an institution instead of a child. He noticed her tension and asked whether the crowds were angry with him. The princess assured him they were reacting to adult decisions, not blaming him. William later placed a steadying hand on George's shoulder as they entered a private chapel service. That single gesture became the day's emotional symbol, a father shielding a boy from the weight of his future. That evening, the signed declaration rested inside the royal archive beyond argument, revision, or private persuasion. Prince George had not replaced his father. Camilla's children had not lost a throne they never possessed. What ended was something less visible, but equally dangerous. The belief that closeness to a sovereign could gradually become a form of inherited authority. The crown had drawn its line, and every person involved had paid a different price for its clarity. Charles sat alone in his office and touched the pen used to sign the document. When Camilla entered, he admitted that acting earlier would have spared them all a deeper humiliation. His delay had allowed private expectations to grow into public danger. He would not withdraw the decision because a monarch who avoided a difficult boundary could leave someone else to exploit the silence. Camilla told him she would not ask for the declaration to be changed. Her sadness remained, but her anger had softened into acceptance. Protecting Tom and Laura from feeling excluded could never justify placing them near responsibilities belonging to William and George. Her children had not been condemned as enemies. They had simply been separated from authority. They were never meant to inherit. William visited George before bed and explained that being named in the declaration did not mean the throne was approaching or childhood had ended. He told his son that the family had promised no one would use affection, uncertainty, or an emergency to control his future. George listened, then asked whether he still had to attend his lessons the next morning. His father smiled for the first time that day and said yes. Catherine stood alone with the handwritten Windsor note in her hand. She placed it into the fire because the warning it preserved was no longer needed. Charles had protected the institution by limiting his own household. William had protected his son without demanding revenge. Camilla had accepted a boundary that wounded her pride, but prevented a deeper fracture. George's designation was not a coronation, a promotion, or the removal of his father. It was the crown's final declaration that love may shape a royal family, but only law, duty, and the direct line may shape succession. The declaration did not make Prince George king, but it ensured that whenever his day arrives, he will inherit a crown protected from the ambiguities that nearly divided the family before him.